Section 45 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance, by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 28. Not very long after Inglesant had left for Umbria, his friend Don Agostino di Chigi suddenly came to Rome. The Pope's health was rapidly failing, and the excitement concerning his successor was becoming intense. The choice was generally considered to lie between the Cardinals Barberini and de Chigi, though Cardinal Sachetti was spoken of by some, probably, however, merely as a substitute, should both the other parties fail in electing their candidate. It was the policy of the Chigi family to conduct their matters with great caution. None of the family, with the exception of the cardinal, were openly in Rome, and when Don Agostino arrived, he resided in one of the deserted villas hidden among vineyards and the gardens of solitary convents, which covered the Palatine and the Aventine in the southern portion of Rome, within the walls. He remained within or with the cardinal during the day, but at night he ventured out into the streets and visited the adherents of his family and those who were working to secure his uncle's elevation. One night the fathers of the oratory gave a concert at which one of the best voices in Rome was to sing. It happened that Don Agostino passed the gate as the company were assembling, and as he did so the street was blocked by the train of some great personage who arrived in a sedan of blue velvet embroidered with silver, accompanied by several gentlemen and servants. Among the former, Agostino recognized the cavaliere di Guardino, the brother of Loretta, of whose acquaintance with Inglesant at Florence, it may be remembered, he was aware, and with him another man whose appearance seemed to recall some distant reminiscence to his mind. He could, however, see him but imperfectly in the flickering torchlight. Apart from his desire to remain unrecognized in Rome, Agostino had no desire to associate with the cavaliere, of whose character he had a very bad opinion. To his annoyance, therefore, as the sedan entered the courtyard, the two persons he had noticed, instead of following their patron, turned round, and in leaving the doorway met Agostino face to face. The cavaliere recognized him immediately, and appeared to grasp eagerly the opportunity to accost him. He began by complimenting him on the near prospect of his uncle's elevation to the papacy, professing to consider the chances of his election very good indeed, and added that he presumed business connected with these matters had brought him to Rome. To this Agostino replied that, so far as he knew, his uncle had no expectation of such an honour being at all likely to be offered him, and that private affairs of his own, of a very delicate nature, of a kind indeed which a gentleman of the cavaliere's known gallantry could well understand, had brought him to Rome, as indeed he might see from the secrecy he maintained, and by his not being present at any of the entertainments which were going forward. He then inquired in his turn why the cavaliere had not entered the college. The other made some evasive answer, but it appeared to Agostino that both the cavaliere and his companion were not on the most familiar terms with the noblemen they had accompanied, although it might suit their purpose to appear in his train. Guardino, indeed, changed the subject hastily, and spoke of Inglesant, praising him highly. He inquired whether the Cardinal di Chigi was acquainted with him, and whether it was likely that, either as an attendant upon him or upon Cardinal Rinuccini, Inglesant would be admitted into the conclave. Don Agostino replied vaguely that Inglesant was then at Umbria, and that he could offer no opinion as to the probability of the latter part of his inquiry. He thought that he could see from the expression on the other's face that the cavalier thought that he was deceiving him, and that he jumped at once to the conclusion that, as the attendant of one or other of the cardinals, Inglesant would be present at the conclave. Gardino went on to speak of Inglesant's character, regretting the craze of mind, as he called it, which his ill health had produced, and which rendered him, as he said, unfit for business or for taking his part in the affairs of life. He went on to speak with unconcealed contempt of Inglesant's religious ideas and scruples, and of his association with Molinos, intimating, however, his opinion that it would not be impossible to overcome these scruples could a suitable temptation be found. These fancies once removed, he continued, Inglesant's value as a trusted and secret agent would be greatly increased. He seemed to be talking abstractedly, and as a perfectly disinterested person who was discussing an interesting topic of morals or mental peculiarity. Agostino could not understand his drift. He answered him that the Jesuits did not need unscrupulous bravos. If they did, they could be found at every street corner by the score. He added that he imagined that the services which Inglesant had already performed and might perform again were of a special and delicate character, for which his temperament and habit of mind, which were chiefly the result of the society's training, especially fitted him. They had by this time reached the Corso, and Agostino took the opportunity of parting with his companions, excusing himself on the ground of his pretended assignation. He was no sooner gone than the cavalier, according to the narrative which was afterwards related by Malvolti, began to explain more clearly than he had hitherto done what his expectations and intentions were. He was forced to confide in Malvolti more than he otherwise would have done, to prevent his ridding himself of Inglesant's presence by violent means. When the Italian first saw Inglesant, whom he had never met in England, in the theatre in Florence, he was startled and terrified by his close resemblance to his murdered brother, and his first thought was that his victim had returned to earth, and, invisible to others, was permitted to avenge himself upon his murderer by haunting and terrifying his paths. When he discovered, however, that the cavalier not only saw the appearance which had so alarmed him, but could tell him who Inglesant was, and to a certain extent what the motives were which had brought him to Italy, his superstitious fears gave place to more material apprehensions and expedients. He at once resolved to assassinate Inglesant on leaving the theatre in the first street through which he might pass, a purpose which he might easily have accomplished during Inglesant's careless and unguarded wanderings round the house of Loretta's father that night. From this intention he was with difficulty diverted by the reasoning of the cavalier, who represented to him the rashness of such an action, protected as Inglesant was by the most powerful of societies, which would not fail to punish any act which deprived it of a useful agent. The unnecessary character of the attempt, Inglesant being at present in complete ignorance that his enemy was near him, and above all the folly of destroying a person who might otherwise be made the medium of great personal profit and advantage. He explained to Malvolti Inglesant's connection with the Chigi family, and the position of influence he would occupy should the cardinal be elected to the popedom. Finally, he went so far as to hint at the possibility of an alliance between Malvolti and his sister, should Inglesant remain uninjured. Malvolti had only arrived in Florence on the previous day, and the cavalier met him accidentally in the theatre. But Gardino's plans with relation to Inglesant and his sister were already so far matured that he had arranged for the abrupt departure of his father and Loretta from Florence. His object was to keep in his own hands a powerful magnet of attraction, which would bind, as he supposed, Inglesant to his interests, but he was by no means desirous that he should marry his sister immediately, if at all. The election for the papacy was a very uncertain issue, and if the de Chigi faction failed, Inglesant's alliance would be of little value. He had two strings to his bow, novelty, between whom and the cavalier association in vice and even crime had riveted many a bond of interest and dependence, was closely connected with the Barberini faction as an unscrupulous and useful tool. Should the Cardinal Barberini be elected pope, or should Cardinal Sacchetti, who was in his interest, be chosen, his own connection with Malvolti might be of great value to the Cavalieri, and the greater service the latter could render to the Barberini faction in the approaching crisis the better. The weak point of his position on this side was the character of Malvolti and the subordinate position he occupied among the adherents of the Barberini. On the other hand, if Cardinal Chigi were the future pontiff, the prospects of any one connected with Inglesant would be most brilliant, as the latter, from his connection with the Jesuits and as the favorite of the Pope's nephew, would at once become one of the most powerful men in Italy. The weak point on this side was that his hold on Inglesant was very slight, and that even supposing it to be strengthened by marriage with Loretta, Inglesant's character and temper were such as would probably make him useless and impracticable in the attempt to secure the glittering and often illicit advantages which would be within his reach. Between his perplexing choice, the only wise course appeared to be to temporize with both parties, and to attempt in the meantime to secure an influence with either. The fortunes both of the Cavalieri and of Malvolti were at this moment pretty nearly desperate, and their means of influencing any one very small. Indeed, having wasted what had once been considerable wealth and talent, there remained nothing to the Cavalieri but his sister, and of that last possession he was prepared to make unscrupulous use. It would be of small advantage to him to give his sister's hand to Inglesant, unless he could first by her means corrupt and debase his conscience, and that lofty standard of conduct which he appeared, to the Cavalieri at least, unswervingly to follow, and the Italian devil at his side suggested a means to this end, as wild in conception as the result proved it impotent and badly planned. This Italian devil was not Malvolti, though that person was one of his most successful followers and imitators. When the inspired writer has described the princes and angels which rule the different nations of the earth, he does not go on to enumerate the distinct powers of evil which in different countries pursue their divers malefic courses, yet it would seem that those existences are no less real than the others, that the character of the inhabitants of any country has much to do in forming a distinct devil for that country no man can doubt, or that in consequence the temptations which beset mankind in certain countries are of a distinct and peculiar kind. This fact is sometimes of considerable advantage to the object of the tempter's art, for if, acting upon his knowledge of the character of any people, this merely local devil lays snares in the path of a stranger, it is not impossible that the bait may fail. This was very much what happened to John Inglesant. Of the sins which were really his temptations, the Cavalieri knew nothing, but he could conceive of certain acts which he concluded Inglesant would consider to be sins. These acts were of a gross and sensual nature, for the Italian devil, born of the fleshly lusts of the people, was unable to form temptations for the higher natures, and of course his pupils were equally impotent. The result was singular. Acting upon the design of ruining Inglesant's moral sense, of debasing the ideal of conduct at which he aimed, and of shattering and defiling what the Cavalieri considered the fantastic purity of his conscience, he formed a scheme which had the effect of removing Inglesant from a place where he was under the strongest temptation and in the greatest danger of violating his conscience, and of placing him in circumstances of trial which, though dangerous, he was still, from the peculiarity of his character, much better able to resist. A marriage connection with Inglesant would at this juncture be of little avail. but a wild and illicit passion which would involve him in a course of licentious and confused action, in which the barriers of morality and the scruples of conscience would be alike annihilated, and the whole previous nature of the victim of lawless desire altered, would, if any agent could produce so great a change, transform Inglesant into the worldly-minded and unscrupulous accomplice that the cavalier wished him to become. How great the fall would be he could, of course, in no way estimate, but he had sufficient insight to perceive that the shock of it would probably be sufficient, acting upon a consciousness so refined and delicate as that of Inglesant, to render recovery, if ever attained, very difficult and remote. Upon this wild scheme he acted. He had removed his sister when he had thought that Inglesant had been sufficiently ensnared to make his after course certain and precipitate. Inglesant's character, which was so very imperfectly known to the cavalier, and circumstances such as his confinement in the pest-house, had delayed the consummation of the plot. But the cavalier conceived that the time had now arrived for its completion. He brought his sister back to Florence, and placed her with the Grand Duchess in some subordinate situation which his family and his sister's character enabled him to obtain. Having had some previous knowledge of her, the Duchess soon became attached to Loretta, and obtained her confidence. From her she learnt Inglesant's story and character, and wished to see him at the court. While the two ladies were planning schemes for future pleasure, the cavalier suddenly appeared at Florence, and informed his sister that he had concluded, with the approbation of his father, a marriage contract between herself and Malvolti. Terrified by this threatened connection with a man whose person she loathed and whose character she detested, Loretta flew to the Duchess and entreated her to send at once for Inglesant, who, they were both aware, was at that moment with the Duke of Umbria, the Grand Duchess's aged father. With the result we are acquainted. End of chapter 28.